In Hollywood, a big name is supposed to be a sure thing. It's like an insurance policy. But what happens when the entire industry places a massive 9-figure bet on one of the biggest names in literary history, and it all just spectacularly blows up in their faces? Today, we're diving into a Hollywood horror story, but the victims aren't on screen, they're in the studio's accounting department. Let's get into it. And right at the center of this whole mess is one single legendary author. The analysis we're looking at frames it perfectly. Hollywood's newest horror story isn't a movie. It's the fact that they bet the farm on the master of horror himself, Stephen King, and ended up with a financial nightmare. And look, this wasn't just a casual decision to make a single movie. This was a massive strategic move. The argument here is that Hollywood executives decided that Stephen King was the brand, the one icon who could anchor their entire 2025 box office. The sheer scale of this bet was just huge. We are talking about 4 separate major theatrical releases all in a single year. The Running Man, The Life of Chuck, The Long Walk, and The Monkey. The thinking behind it all was pretty simple. Just slap Stephen King on the poster and the audience will show up, no questions asked. It was a multi-million-dollar strategy built entirely on the power of that one name. Well, that bet did not pay off. In fact, you could say it was a catastrophe. The results were so bad, they sent some serious shockwaves through the industry. Let's actually look at the hard numbers because they tell a story of financial failure that's impossible to ignore. Yeah, and this data is just brutal. The Life of Chuck was an outright bomb, not even cracking $7 million. The Running Man reboot opened to a disastrous $17 million and was immediately projected to be a major loss. Even The Long Walk, which did a bit better, still underperformed expectations. The only film to make any real money was The Monkey, and that's only because it had a super tiny budget to begin with. So 3 out of 4 films were just major financial disappointments. So you have to be asking, why on earth did Hollywood make this bet in the first place? Well, you have to remember the context. It really wasn't that long ago that Stephen King's name was absolute box office gold. I mean, the 2-part film adaptation of his novel It wasn't just a movie. It was a cultural phenomenon and an absolute commercial juggernaut. The disconnect is just staggering when you see the numbers right next to each other like this. The 2 It films pulled in over $500 million, and that's just in the US. Meanwhile, the 4 2025 films, all combined, couldn't even break $100 million. A gap that big, that massive, forces a very difficult question. What in the world went wrong? How did Hollywood get this so incredibly backwards? The analysis we're exploring today points to 2 major factors. And the first one is pretty provocative. It suggests the problem wasn't just the movies. It was the man himself. The argument is that the very asset Hollywood was betting on, Stephen King's public image, had somehow transformed from their greatest strength into a major liability. The core idea here is that the author's public persona has shifted, and shifted dramatically. The analysis suggests King became an increasingly polarizing figure, and in doing so, he might have alienated a huge chunk of the very audience the studios were desperately trying to attract. Now, this is a direct quote from the analysis, and yeah, it's intentionally harsh. The commentators use the word deranged to describe their view of King's intense focus on online political battles, suggesting it created an image that was just plain off-putting to mainstream moviegoers who just wanted to see a scary movie. And the analysis points to some very specific examples to back this up. First, his constant and often pretty aggressive political commentary on social media. Second, there was this widely circulated promotional video for The Long Walk that the commentators just called awkward and deeply ineffective, making them wonder who at the studio even approved it. And finally, there was this more general perception they noted of an author who, in public, just seemed miserable and bitter, a vibe they felt was totally at odds with his incredible success and one that didn't exactly make people want to rush out and support his work. But the critique doesn't end with the author's persona. The source also identifies a really critical flaw in the creative approach to these new films. It's something they call the curse of faithfulness. So the theory here is pretty crucial. It's that Stephen King is an absolutely brilliant storyteller right up until he gets to the ending. The most successful film adaptations in history, think The Shining or even the original Running Man, they worked precisely because they changed his famously weak or unsatisfying endings to make them work on screen. The 2025 films, the argument goes, made the fatal mistake of being way too loyal to the books. This slide just lays out the two different playbooks perfectly. On one side, you've got the classics. Stanley Kubrick famously threw out most of King's novel to create his masterpiece, The Shining. The original Running Man completely flipped the bleak ending of the book on its head. Then on the other side, you have the 2025 version of The Running Man, which reportedly stuck much closer to the novel's downer conclusion, leaving audiences feeling like their time was totally wasted. The pattern, according to these commentators, is crystal clear. In this quote right here, it just crystallizes their entire creative argument. It is a bold, sweeping statement, for sure, but it's the central pillar of their critique of the films themselves. The claim is that Hollywood completely forgot the golden rule of adapting Stephen King. You have to fix his stories for the screen, not just film the pages. All right, so this all leads us to the final and maybe the most damning part of the analysis. The commentators argue that this whole string of failures isn't just about one author or 4 movies. Nope, it's a symptom of a much, much larger problem inside the industry itself. The big thesis here is that the entire studio system has become disillusioned, that it's just fundamentally lost touch with its audience. From this point of view, the decision to greenlight 4 faithful King adaptations wasn't just a creative mistake. It was an ideological one, born from a complete misreading of the cultural landscape. So the theory laid out by the analysis goes something like this. These films were all greenlit back around 2022, during a very specific cultural and political moment. Studio executives, who probably shared what they saw as King's worldview, thought bringing his raw, politically charged stories to the screen in 2025 would be a kind of ideological victory lap. But the miscalculation was huge. By the time the films actually came out, the audience's priorities had totally shifted. They wanted to be entertained, not lectured. And so the ultimate verdict from this analysis is clear, and it's concise. In their view, Hollywood chose to back an ideology they personally agreed with, instead of focusing on what their job is, crafting compelling entertainment. The audience, in turn, voted with their wallets and overwhelmingly rejected the product they were being sold. It was a massive and very, very costly miscalculation. It all leaves us with this one last, really fascinating question. When a plan this big fails this spectacularly, who's really to blame? Is it the writer, who may have alienated his own audience? Is it the studio that completely misread the cultural moment? Or maybe is it just the audience, whose tastes have changed, leaving an old, once successful formula in the dust? That, right there, is the billion-dollar question that Hollywood now has to answer.